Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today I just wanted to go over the books that I read in October. October was a really good reading month for me. I read a lot of amazing books, several 5-star books, as well as just more books than I've read in a while. In September I read maybe 4 books, and this month I read 8 books, which I'm really happy about. I feel like I'm back in the groove with getting a lot of reading done. My Goodreads goal is 100 for the year, and I'm currently at like 79, I think. So I'm technically like a little bit behind, like 2 books-ish behind, because my reading goal requires that I read 8 books per month at least. So yeah, I'm a little behind, but I felt like I did really well this month in catching up with my goal and just reading quality books. But all that being said, let's get into my October reading wrap-up. Okay, first up, I have a book that probably is my favorite book of the month, and it is Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. So this one follows a photographer named Irina who takes explicit photographs of men. And these aren't like model type men, these are just men that she finds out and about while scouting for just random guys. And she takes them back to her studio and she photographs them in like compromising positions. So it's about that, it's about how she takes advantage of these guys, it's about her backstory and her history and her various addictions and just toxic lifestyle, toxic personality traits, etc. So Irina is an unlikable narrator for sure. She's very unlikable, she's very intimidating and aggressive and often scary. But this book was weird and creepy and unsettling, and I absolutely loved it. It was a 5-star read. I had been recommended this book by several of my friends on Bookstagram, and I'd seen this book everywhere, and I was like, it looks right up my alley. I definitely have to read it. And I finally read it, and it was just amazing. It was one of my favorite books probably of the year. This cover is really cool, and I really loved this book. So it's definitely a weird one. Just be warned if you're gonna pick this one up, but I highly recommend. Alright, moving on. This month I also sort of rediscovered my love for nonfiction audiobooks. I did a lot of those before when I was driving to college. I had a 50-minute commute each way. I just find that it's a lot easier for me to absorb like a nonfiction book with a lot of technical information or anything like that while I am driving or working on something or whatever. It's easier on audio for me rather than trying to sit and read it because I get distracted easily and I can't focus on it or I get bored, even if it's a really interesting book. So all that being said, I did read another book by Peggy Ornstein, and it's the companion to Girls and Sex, which I read last month. It is Boys and Sex. So this one basically just does pretty much the same thing as Girls and Sex. It examines adolescents and children growing up and learning about sex and coming into their own and all of the different things surrounding sex that we have to face in the 21st century. So in this one, Peggy Ornstein talks to a lot of high school and college boys and gets their perspectives on hookup culture and sex and just everything to do with sex. So like Girls and Sex, this is also a 4-star read because, again, it's really hard for me to give a nonfiction a 5-star. It has to be an all-time top-tier favorite that I would read again and again. And I might read this again, but I don't know that it's a favorite. But it is really informative. So with Girls and Sex, there was a lot that I could relate to and understand on a more personal level, and I had more of a personal connection to it. But with Boys and Sex, obviously I didn't relate to a lot of the things the boys were saying, but it gave me a new perspective on men and boys. But it really talked about a lot of things that I didn't know boys and men felt about sex and relationships and hookups and all these other things. And in that way, I found this book really interesting and informative. But both of these 2 books can be a really great conversation starter and jumping off point for conversations with your child, if you have a child, or even your partner. And I think it's really interesting to read those and then kind of try to apply the concepts and ideas and thoughts in the books to your life. So I really enjoyed these books, and I think that they're a really great duo of discussions of sex and adolescence. But I finished Boys and Sex this month, and I gave it 4 stars. So moving right along to another nonfiction book that I've been talking about for months, and it is Unwell Women by Eleanor Cleghorn. So this is a discussion of misdiagnosis of women throughout history and how we haven't been believed about our medical conditions and how we've been mislabeled and mistreated and all of that. So I haven't decided if this book is going to be a 3 or a 4 star. It's kind of a 3.5 right now because a lot of what's discussed is really, really interesting and in-depth. But for me, it was almost like too in-depth. Like there is so many pages, almost 100 pages in the back of this book of just references and notes and bibliography, etc. There was so much information packed into this book. And while there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, I think that's great, it is a little bit intimidating and overwhelming to tackle this huge book that has so much technical information in it. But that being said, I think it's really well written. I think it has a lot to offer in terms of information about women's health throughout history. I learned a lot in this book. And it was a real trip to get here to finish this damn book. Oh my God, I started this in the summer and I just finished it now. So that is a little bit of an indication of how weighty this book is and how much information there is to this book that it took me so long to get through it. But again, it was kind of a 3.5 star because I think it was really informative and well done, but my enjoyment of the book wasn't quite up there. So yeah. All right, moving right along, I read a genre that I haven't read in a while, and that is poetry. So this month I read Serious Concerns by Wendy Cope. This is a really tiny collection of poems that I heard about from Carly Thorne, or UnCarly on YouTube. She's talked about this many times. It's one of her favorite poetry collections. So a lot of these poems are really funny and sweet, and they kind of reminded me of Shel Silverstein poetry. I've always been a big Shel Silverstein fan, especially when I was a kid. But a lot of these kind of reminded me of that sing-songy, light, kind of silly poem. And then on the other hand, some of these poems used humor and the levity of the poems and the rhythm to talk about deeper subjects and harder subjects. I read this in like an afternoon and I think I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads, but I enjoyed it. It just wasn't an all-time favorite for poetry, but I do recommend this if you're interested in getting into poetry because it is a pretty accessible, easy read in terms of poetry, and it's also really fun. So highly recommend Wendy Cope if you're into poetry. Okay, I've already talked about one of these books on this channel, but I did end up reading 2 books by the same author back to back. That's how much I loved this author's first book. So the first one is Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez. I had seen this book absolutely everywhere on social media, and I had been recommended this book so many times, and I saw that it was compared to Shirley Jackson's work as well. So I figured I would love this book, and I definitely did. I gave this one 5 stars. This is a collection of short stories that is translated from Spanish. It's set in Argentina and kind of follows a bunch of different characters through kind of horror scenarios. So there's supernatural stuff, there's psychological stuff, and there's a lot of discussion of the Argentine folklore brought into all of the stories. So it has a really nice mix of that folklore and the horror kind of coming together in a really interesting way. And having short stories as the format is also really unique and interesting because I've never read a short story collection that's horror. So to me, it was really unique and interesting, and this is one of my favorite covers ever. But I really, really loved this book. I gave it 5 stars, and immediately after I finished this, actually, I don't think I was even finished with this when I purchased The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, which is Mariana Enriquez's other translated collection. She has quite a few more books, I believe, in Spanish, but these are the only 2 that have been translated into English so far. This is another short story collection, and when I started reading it, the first few stories, I didn't like them. Like, I was kind of disappointed. I was like, there's a 3 star and a 2 star and another 2 star and a 3 star right off the bat. But once I got past those handful of stories, the rest of the stories were absolutely incredible. I think there's a whole line of 5-star stories in this book. I really, really liked this book This one ended up getting 4 stars from me just because a lot of the stories in the beginning were not my favorite, so I couldn't justify giving it 5 stars. And I still really liked her other book better. So if you like horror and you want some paranormal, kind of supernatural, spooky stuff, both of these are great options, and they're just great translated works as well. I am so excited to have read some translated short story collections. I think they're the first ones that I've read, so I really, really liked these, and I'm really glad that I read them in October because they are very fitting for Spooky Month. Next up, I have my reread of the month, and that is I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid. So I have talked about this book many a time. This is one of my favorite books of all time, and it is basically about a couple, Jake and an unnamed narrator, who are driving through the middle of nowhere to visit Jake's parents. And it's about everything that happens in the car, at the parents' house, the subsequent unraveling of the entire story, and that's all I'm going to tell you about it, because if you haven't read it, read it. But this is one of the most masterfully done thriller/horror novels I think ever written. I'll go as far to say that, but it's one of my favorite books of all time, and I went back through and annotated it this time because last time I read it, I just really wanted to get through it and figure out the twist and figure out what was going on because it is very confusing and claustrophobic. But this time I went through and I just annotated as I went, so there's like quite a few pages that have my scribbling on them, and I had a lot of fun doing that because now I can really connect the dots between all of the clues and everything that happens in the book and draw it all together to make sense of it. So that was a really, really cool experience. It almost felt like reading a different book than when I read it the first time, honestly. But yeah, if you've read this book, I would highly suggest reading it again and annotating it if you have a physical copy that you want to write on, because I got so much more out of it, and it was such a richer experience than reading it for the first time. So if you've already read it again. If you haven't read it, read it. That probably came off as very aggressive, but I love that book, and I think everyone should read it. So moving on, we have my last book of October, and that is The Grip of It by Jack Jemk. I think that's how you say it. This book was on a list of books similar to Shirley Jackson. So I looked up a list of Shirley Jackson adjacent literature, and this came up. And oh my goodness, it definitely delivered on the Jackson-esque vibes. So this book has been compared to The Haunting of Hill House, just because of how slow of a burn The Haunting of Hill House is, and it's definitely got similar themes in terms of haunting, and it all centers on a house. So that's similar, but just the writing style and how slow-moving and character-driven the stories are really do align. So yeah, I think it's a very fair comparison to compare this to The Haunting of Hill House and just Jackson's style in general. So this one is basically just about a couple who buys and moves into this house, and it's about everything that goes down after they move in. And that's really all that I'll tell you, because this isn't a plot-heavy book. Not a lot of crazy stuff happens, not a lot happens, period, but it is a very sinister, weird book. And from the get-go, I started annotating this because coming off the heels of I'm Thinking of Ending Things, I definitely felt like I was in an annotating mood for sure. But this book has so much in terms of diction and the choices that the author made. Like, I wrote all over this book just because of how much there is going on. I'll show you this page. Yeah, so this is like a typical page. I wrote all throughout this book. This is a book where you feel like each word chosen was chosen for a particular reason and to a particular end. And I had so much fun going through and annotating all of those things and kind of seeing the choices that were being made throughout the book. So this one gets a 4-star from me because it was a little bit lackluster in terms of like the scare, especially coming off of the 2 Mariana Enriquez books and I'm Thinking of Ending Things. Those were all pretty spooky. So reading this one and not having a lot of spookiness or like really crazy plot going on, it wasn't a favorite of all time, but I really liked the writing of it, and I think it was a masterfully written, suspenseful book. Do I think it's horror? Not really, but that's all right. I still really, really liked it. And the cover is really, really great. So that was my last book of October. All right, these are my October reads. I read 8 books this month, and I'm really proud of myself. I read some really great books. I read many books, and I think there are at least 2 all-time favorites now in this stack. So if that's not a success, I don't know what is. But anyway, I hope that you enjoyed today's video. Please let me know what you read in October, and if you have a favorite read of October or a read that really flopped for you. I'm pretty lucky that I didn't have to DNF anything this month like I did last month. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.